Alright, if you're back from the other video on this car, welcome back. Welcome if you're just starting with this one. This is going to be a reassembly of the drum brake on a 1963 Valiant. But again, drum brakes are all so related. If you can do one, you can do just about any of them. For instance, myself, I learned at a very young age to learn how to do drum brakes. My dad actually taught me on this very car. And in later years, when I was working around heavy equipment, I started doing drum brakes on semi-trucks and trailers. And it just comes naturally at that point because the system isn't much different other than it's larger. And semi-trucks use air brakes instead of hydraulic, but the principle on all these drum brakes is the same. So if it's a 1960s or a 2023, if you can find a 2023 with drum brakes, it's going to be basically the same. But I want to show some of the things that people may do wrong or don't do right, because drum brakes do get a bad rep. If they're all in good working order, the vehicle will stop fine. You're not going to crash, because if that was the case, all the cars from the 1960s and 70s, well, not the 70s, I think late 60s is when they started doing disc brakes, but all the cars from the 50s and 60s, the front ends would be all smashed up, and obviously they're not. But it is easy to overlook stuff on drum brakes. It's also easy to make mistakes or just let them neglect, and they will perform poorly then, just like anything that's neglected. I'm starting by replacing this wheel cylinder, and if you saw the other one, you remember I had to take off the bleeder screw to get the flare wrench back there. It's held on by two bolts, go through the back. They're 3/8 on this vehicle. And this is where the hydraulic line goes. You can usually line it up as you put it together. And then there's obviously the bolt holes down there, and the bolt holes right there. So we just line that up. Put it in place. I'm sure there's a torque spec for this too. There's a torque spec for everything, but I just make them snug. Don't want them to back off. Don't want them to break. If you're uncertain, just look up the torque specs for whatever you're working on. This is the emergency brake actuator. So it goes on this cable down here. I pull the spring back. Okay. That is about the worst part of the job, trying to get that lined up. If you're just doing your brakes, obviously you don't have to disassemble that. That was off because I had to change the backing plate as per that earlier video. Alright, here is going to be one of, if not the biggest mistake made when assembling drum brakes, on older automobiles at least. There is a primary and a secondary shoe. See that? The primary shoe is always shorter than the secondary. If you look at it this way, they all have the same holes. They absolutely can be installed backwards. The primary shoe always faces the front of the vehicle. If you get it backwards, the brake will grab hard. Every time you apply the brake, it's just going to snap on. And what happens is some people think, well, they're not adjusted right. And so they'll tighten it and tighten it and tighten it. And eventually it will stop snapping because they're always applied. And what's happening then is they're getting really hot because you're driving around with a brake that's applied or partially applied. So you're wearing your brakes out prematurely. You've reduced your braking ability because you got one brake that's hot all the time. And you're ruining fuel economy because you're dragging around a partially applied brake. So always make sure your short shoe is the primary and it's facing towards the front of the vehicle. When you get a box of brake shoes, it comes with enough to do both sides. So it has 4 brake shoes in there. You don't do just one side. And all you gotta do is just take all your brake shoes out and line them up. If you got 2 longs and 2 shorts, well, there you go. Now, newer vehicles, you know, particularly ones that have disc brake on the front and drum in the rear, they tend to have all long shoes. They don't have a primary and secondary anymore. And at that point, it doesn't matter if they're all the long kind. So if you line them all up and they're all the same, then don't worry about it. But if you line them up and they look like that, or something similar to that, then you know you got a primary and a secondary. Get that right, and that alone is going to make for much smoother braking and less frustration trying to figure out what's wrong with your brakes and how to make them work again. The number 2 issue is with the star adjuster. This is what is used to adjust the brakes, both manually and automatically. Now if you look, I can't turn that. It's stuck on there. I can turn this in, which is good. You need to be able to turn that one too, so if that's stuck, you need to deal with that too. But that's a thread, and I can't turn it. It's totally stuck. So if you're going to reuse this, which is fine, you're going to have to get that broke loose, totally unthread it, take it to the wire wheel, clean it up and put it in there. It has to turn smoothly. So I wouldn't even put grease on it because that would slow it down. But this is a brake that is not adjusting. Now I have a hardware kit. I don't know. Okay, this kit does come with the new one, so I don't have to play with that. And these kits are specific to right and left, so make sure if you buy both of them, you don't mix them up. But you see what you got. See, there's an L there. We're working on the left side of the car. There's a cable on this, and when you stop the car under normal circumstances, this moves up and down. And the more the shoes are worn out, the more it moves. Well, it's sitting on this, so when it's moving, it's also tightening your brake. See how that's slowly coming out? Now obviously this is exaggerated, it's not moving this much, but as your brakes wear, it adjusts it out. So if that's binding, it's either going to just sit there, not do anything, or it'll skip over it. Which kind of looks like it might have been happening with this one, because you see how all the teeth are clean on the very top. So these are very specific in the direction they go. So we take our primary shoe, and this hooks in like that, so we know the star wheel has to go where the adjuster's at. It's not going to go this way. It's got to go like that. There's a cap that fits on there. On the other side, on the right side, it's going to be reverse. This will be in the front. It's a good idea if you're not familiar with drum brakes. Just do one side at a time. That way, if you forget where something goes, you can always open up the other side and just copy that, but kind of in reverse. But you'll get the idea. Take pictures too, obviously. But the reverse thing doesn't apply to the shoes. They're always secondary to the rear, primary to the front. So here's that cap, and there's a washer that goes to it. This is the spring kit. This is just the adjuster kit. I forgot about the spring kit. So that's the new one. It just slides on there. And then you get pliers and pinch it together. That's all there is to it. Now this is where it's a little different on these old Chryslers. They use a spring and a retaining clip to hold the shoes on, whereas a traditional vehicle has a spring that's held in by one of these rods and something like that, and you just use this to push the spring down. If you watched an earlier video, you can see me disassembling this. This is more typical. This is a Chrysler concoction here. It works, it's just a little more awkward to work with. So we put our retainer in there, and what I have is a small screwdriver. Years back I cut a little notch in it, and it captures that flat of the spring there. That's what you got to do. Put the spring through there, and then you're trying to hook that onto that retainer back there. This side's a little harder to see because of that that e-brake. Okay, so that's on there. So what you see is these different tabs have a place. This top curved one is right up there where it's curved here, and then this goes inside the wheel cylinder. So the wheel cylinder is open on the ends, and so that just sits on there like that. And it'll all get drawn together when we put the new springs on it. Alright, this is part of the emergency brake actuator. It just goes underneath the slave cylinder and goes right into that notch right there. Now there's supposed to be an anti-clatter spring, which looks a lot like that, because that's what that is, but it's too big for this. This is off of the 10-inch brake, and hard as I might, I cannot source this for the 9-inch brake. And that's the one spring that the spring kit doesn't have in it. It's got everything else except that. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just all it's supposed to do is when the emergency brake is not on and you're driving, it keeps us from clattering around. So if anybody watching this happens to know the proper anti-clunk spring or anti-rattle spring for the Mopar 9-inch brakes on the 7.25 axle, let me know in the comments. The number that's floating around on the web is wrong, because I did buy that and it was the 8-cylinder, or I should say the 10-inch brakes that are on the 8-cylinder, but can't find the 6. Alright, going to the other side, we're doing the same thing with that retainer. Just goes in that hole. Primary shoe goes in that hole. So with this one, we got 3 things we're looking at: that curved spot, the slave cylinder, and then the emergency brake actuator. So we line all that up. Okay, get in there. Now, put the star wheel in. Get that adjuster. This spring goes in like that over here, and then we need to stretch it out to where it fits into that hole right there, like that. Later on, we're going to put a cable down here that goes on the other side of that hole. Alright, so we got 2 new springs. These are the ones that are going to hold the brakes to the backing plate, or to, I should say, in the closed position, because obviously these hold it to the backing plate too. So before I get that far, This is another part of the adjuster, and so was this. In fact, let me move you. Yeah, probably get a better view there. So this goes up here. Then this is going to go around that, but right now we're not going to worry about how we hook that up just yet. But what we want to do is get one of our new springs, and so the spring goes in there, and so it holds that in place too. And with this in place, we go ahead and put the spring on. And that's where this tool is a real lifesaver. So, just like that, except I think, yeah, I got this on the wrong side. This needs to be on top of the spring. Just try to tuck it out of the way for the moment. And whether you use this tool or you use pliers, doesn't matter, although I prefer the tool. But always watch where you put your fingers, because if this slips and your hand is down there, that spring is going to go into your thumb, and that will hurt. I keep having to push the shoe back because it's trying to come off of that round. There we go. So that's going to end up on top of that, but we're not ready for that yet. But you can push that back because we need to make room for the next spring. And it's the same thing exactly, except you don't have the adjustment paraphernalia to deal with, so it is easier to do this side. All right, so we're done up here. All we're looking at now is hooking this up, and this goes into that top hole that I showed you before we put that in there. And the easiest way to get that in there, if you don't lose tools, is to lift up on this like so. And then that will fit whoops, too far. Pop the star wheel out. There we go. Okay, so that's in the hole. Now, push that up and just loop that back there. Okay, there's a ridge on the top of that. I didn't show that to you, but there's a ridge that rides in. And that is a completely assembled brake. Now, so now what we need to do is a basic adjustment on the vehicle. See, the drum is measuring like just under 9 inches, like 8 and 9/16. And so we want this to be close. We can do that real quickly by adjusting the star wheel. See, this thing's really loose because I have it adjusted all the way in. Okay, so I was showing you about measuring across the inner diameter of the drum and getting the outer part of your shoes to not match, you know, just under it so the drum can slide on, but you want it close. And there is a tool for that also, but I showed you the tape measure first because this tool's not something that average households are going to have. Again, it's not expensive, but it's kind of a luxury tool. So you just loosen that nut. I'll use this for a stand, and you just bring that out till it's at the widest part of the drum. Tighten that nut, and you can look at the graduations here if you want to measure exactly what it is, but that's not really too important because now all you got to do, this measures the inside, and so now you can turn it around and you want your shoes to match that. So I'm kind of loose here, so I'm going to open it up with the star wheel. The closer you can get it on the outside, the better, because it's easier to do what I'm doing right now than going behind there with that spoon and tightening it up. Ideally, when you're done, what you want is the brakes just barely touching. And that's where front brakes are a little easier to do because you can spin the wheel once it's all assembled. You spin the wheel and you tighten it up, and just when you hear a ch, ch, you know you're good. Some of you may have thought I left a part off, this little part here, because I thought so too. After I had finished up the other night, I was thinking about it and realized I didn't put this back on. But upon closer inspection, I believe that this is just for the 10-inch brakes. A couple reasons. One, this goes here, and there's a machine step right there for this to sit on. There's no such step on this one. Also, as thick as that is, there's not that much room in there. So if this was to go on there, you couldn't get the springs on. So I'm pretty convinced that that's just on the 10-inch brakes. So I got this brake in the ballpark. And now we're going to go underneath. Put that line back on. Okay, I just have that bleeder hand screwed in there so I can take that right back out. The line goes into the lower hole, obviously. Okay, I got it started. This line nut is a 3/8. And you want to snug it, but again, don't wrench down hard on it because of the fact it's kind of soft. You obviously don't want it to back off either. So that's in place. And I'm going to go ahead and tighten this. Because this is not the, it's not the right wrench either. Nope. This is not the wheel that you start with when you're bleeding your brakes. You do the one that's the farthest away from the master cylinder, so that's the passenger side rear. And then you go to this one, and then you go to passenger front, and then driver front. So I'll go get a wrench and tighten that up, and then once it's tight, I got that little dust cover that goes on it to keep dirt out of the bleeder. Okay, so it's about time to wrap this up. There's a few things we'll go over, and kind of a recap too of what I discussed. So something you may run into is if you have a friend that quote unquote knows cars, he may tell you that you can just leave out all this adjustment mechanism. You know, just run that spring straight across, leave this out, leave the spring out. Not that spring, but leave the cable out and that little guide, because they'll say something dumb like it doesn't work, it doesn't do anything, you know, whatever. But if it didn't work and didn't do anything, the manufacturer would not have put it in there. And my point was from the get-go, when these self-adjusters don't work, it's because, you know, 90% of the time this is stuck. It can't do its job when it's stuck. So when it's in good working order, the self-adjusters work absolutely fine. To manually adjust them, which you should do after a new brake job, because after you drive around a little bit, the shoes, the hardware, and everything is going to settle into its final configuration, and that usually means you have to tighten it up a little bit more. On the back of this, there are two portals. See, one on each side, and one of them is where you go in to adjust the star. The reason there are two slots is because it's the same backing plate used on the other side. And so if the star is on this slot on this side, let me see, so the star is actually on this slot on this side. When you go to the other side, it's going to be on this side. So that's why there's two. So just look a flashlight in there, or just put it in there, and if you hear it clicking, then you got it. If it's not doing anything, then you got the wrong one. The kit will come with these rubber plugs that you put in there. Keeps water and dirt and stuff out. People often leave them off. Like this one only had one on it just now when we disassembled it. I don't recommend taking shortcuts, so I would personally put both of them back on. So a couple ways to adjust that is, like I mentioned, spinning the wheel, which in the rear is harder to do because you're also spinning the axle. And then just listening, tighten it up while you're doing it. Just listen till these just touch. Or some people like to just adjust it until the drum stops turning and then back it off a little bit. I'm not a big fan of that, but that is what some people do. But what we did now with measuring the drum and measuring the shoes got us in the ballpark, because if you can look down here, how much thread stick out we got. If I had assembled it without doing that, I'd have been back there for quite a while turning that wheel, getting it out to where it is now. So any final adjustment I do now won't be significant. So kind of to recap why I was talking about drum brakes getting a bad rap is because of their poor performance due to either improper assembly or negligence or wear and tear. Comes from these points. First one, like I showed you, primary shoe on the front. People get it backwards or both on one side. That's the big one. The self-adjuster not working properly is another big one. And or missing all of the hardware to make the self-adjuster work, because people will leave that out thinking it doesn't do anything anyway. Well, obviously it does. And unless you want to be under there adjusting your brakes constantly, you want that working. When they're all in good shape and they're all functioning like they should, the vehicle will stop fine. Just as good as disc brakes. I won't really go there. Disc brakes do have advantages. I don't know if it's so much as stopping power as in other benefits, which we'll discuss in a minute. But the truck behind me is a F-250 and it's got disc brakes on it. Dual caliper disc brakes. They're big. It's a 3/4 ton diesel, 4-wheel drive. I also have a 69 F-250 that's drum all the way around, and I almost want to say the 69 stops better than the newer truck, but the newer truck does have a lot more weight behind it too. But I'm really not going to get onto that argument, because some people might argue one's better than the other, and their disc brakes are better for the reasons we'll discuss in a minute. But I will also point out that semi-trucks to this day still use drum brakes. Yes, there are disc brakes on a lot of semi-equipment, but it does not dominate yet. Maybe someday, but obviously the benefits haven't been significant enough to where the industry changed over. Now, where disc brakes shine in comparison to drum brakes is one, ease of working on, because obviously there's a lot more moving parts here than on a disc brake. Two, heat dissipation. Drum brakes don't get super hot fast, but when they do get hot, they fade. You lose most of your braking power, and it takes quite a while to cool them down. Disc brakes dissipate the heat fast, so even if you get them really hot, you'll burn up your pads and the vehicle will still stop fairly adequately because it dissipates the heat so quickly. Lastly would be water displacement. When you get water, like driving through a deep puddle on drum brakes, well, they tend to retain the water, and that's kind of a frightening experience, because when you go to hit your brakes, the pedal's fine, it's solid. You got it should feel good, but the car keeps going because you have this lubrication of water between the shoe and the drum. Disc brakes just won't do that because it's exposed. As soon as the water is on the disc, the pad pushes the water off the disc. So they do a lot better in water environments too. An old-timer trick back when cars like these were mainstream, when you saw a puddle on the road when you were approaching it, would be to slightly apply your brakes before you hit that puddle and as you drive through the puddle. That way it's keeping the gap between the shoes and the drum non-existent, so water cannot get in there. Not one of those things they teach anymore because drum brakes aren't commonplace. Newer vehicles that have disc in the front and drum in the rear, well, your front brakes do the majority of the work, so even if you had a problem in the rear, you're not really going to notice it anyway because your front end's doing the job. So yeah, I don't mean to imply that these are as good or better, just that they got a bad rap because of the aforementioned things, because you can get in people's cars, even really nice ones that have drum brakes on them, and it pulls, it doesn't stop straight, it jerks, doesn't stop quickly, or you have to pump it because they don't have the adjustment right, so the wheel cylinder's trying to make up the difference. Just bad stuff like that, and people go, well, that's because it's drum brake. No, it's not. They're just not in good repair. Okay, so I'm done with this. Last thing I have to do, and I'm not going to do a video on that, is just bleed the brakes, and then the car will be back in service. So I hope you were... Oh, I got some part numbers for you just in case anybody needs them. Remember, this is all for the 9-inch brakes that I put on. So that... Can't tell if that's focusing. I hope it is. There we go. That's the wheel cylinder, and it uses the same wheel cylinder on both sides. This is the adjuster hardware, all this stuff right here, the star, the adjuster, the cable, and this does both sides. This is the spring kit for the left side. Oh yeah, and left in American car industry is always the driver's side. Doesn't matter where you're standing on the vehicle. Driver's side is the left. And then this one will be your right side. And let me get the brake shoes. And that's the brake shoes for the rear. And again, it does both sides. Okay, so I hope you're able to get something from this, and I hope it helps people get their drum brakes working in good tune. And that's it. Any questions, you can put them in the comments. And thanks for watching as always. Take it easy.